I speak to you in the name of one God, holy and undivided Trinity. You can be seated. Matthew is my least favorite evangelist. I know he was faithful, but he really seems like he would be no fun at all. Probably one of those people who rarely laughed. Of all the gospel writers, Matthew seems to get most energized when subjects like the end of the world come up, and unnervingly excited about the prospect of an eternal furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. His is the only gospel to include stories of the wise and foolish virgins, the sheep and the goats, and the wheat and the weeds. He is all over clear-cut stories in which the good and the bad are separated. People are either blessed or cursed, good or wicked. In other words, he gets ramped up about any story involving judgment. Now, I am guessing the community to which Matthew wrote needed to hear his message with its assurance that they were the good guys and those opposing and oppressing them were the bad guys, and that God had everything in hand, so no worries. At the last, the good guys will be well taken care of, and the bad guys will be weeping, wailing, and gnashing their teeth. But the way I see the world, it's quite a bit more ambiguous than Matthew seems to think it is. I am pretty sure there aren't just wheat people and weed people, but rather lots of mixtures of wheat and weeds, myself included. So, as some sort of hybrid, this talk of ripping up weeds by the roots and throwing them in the fire makes me more than a little nervous. Am I more wheat or more weeds? Am I blessed or cursed? But giving a clear, unambiguous answer to such a question is something parables really do not set out to do. They set out to make us think, see things from different perspectives, not to offer neat explanations. Of course, with this particular parable, as with many, Matthew was not able to leave it alone. So he has Jesus taking the disciples aside and explaining everything in excruciating detail, which flies in the face of what Jesus has just said about parables being tough to interpret. But Matthew loves clarity and explanation, so there it is. Evidently, the servants in the parable also loved clarity, and they were right there with Matthew, eager to latch onto a problem and rush right out to fix it. Like good little doobies, they rush to their master and ask if they can go gather the weeds, getting points in the asking, showing themselves to be good. Now, I am definitely not an expert on grains of the Middle East, but according to scholar and preacher Barbara Brown Taylor, whose thoughts infuse this sermon, she writes, the weeds Jesus is referring to in this parable are darnel, sometimes referred to as tares. Darnel is a relative of wild rice, and one of its features is that as it grows, its roots interweave with whatever it is growing next to, and it loves to grow among wheat. It even looks a lot like wheat. If its little black seeds are ingested, they are toxic to humans, in large amounts causing blindness or even death. Ancient Palestinian farmers would nip it in the bud, uprooting it once or twice before the harvest, and thus avoiding having to do the painstaking work of sorting out the seeds at the end. Letting them grow up together is quite risky, something most farmers were not willing to do. But a risk that the sower in the parable seems willing to tolerate. It seems this sower is so worried about accidentally tearing up some of the wheat that he just lets it all go, despite the fact that he's pretty sure an enemy is responsible for its presence in the field. I suspect if we're honest with ourselves, we each have an inner Matthew. For some of us, he is front and center, while for others, he is buried quite deeply. But that urge to judge, to separate into good and bad, seems to exist in all humans, as if we aren't all hybrid plants, wheat and weeds, grafted into one stalk, as if we can tell just by looking what a person's character is, and as if we get to be judge and jury rolled into one. And one of the obvious problems with easy classifications is that we can write off those we deem to be weeds, judging them to be less valuable than others, and dismissing them until eventually we have dehumanized them completely, which leads to such ugly things as labeling entire races or cultures as lazy or moochers, or demonizing LGBTQ people and parents of trans kids, or dismissing political opponents as trash or idiots. Appalling, as if we get to judge, as if we can tell by looking which child is wheat and which child is weed, as if any of God's beloved children are weeds. It can indeed be mighty hard to tell the difference between a good plant and a bad one. Lord knows I have lovingly tended many a weed in the planter on my deck, only to be stunned when I realize what it is. And the good people of the South, in an effort to stop soil erosion, planted kudzu, which turned out to be an invasive weed that is now destroying native species at an alarming clip, literally engulfing entire habitats and spreading like wildfire. So if we are suspect in our ability to tell the difference between wheat and weeds, I am not sure what makes us think we are all that great at judging people. All I know is that if you turn me loose with a bottle of weed killer, there is a really good chance an awful lot of wheat will be dead by the end of the day. My intentions would be the best. I would go out seeking to do good, but the results would not be pretty. Maybe a better practice would be to listen to the sower, to leave them alone. Let wheat and weeds grow together. Listen to the sower who does not share our need for a pure crop and an efficient operation, who is more interested in growth than perfection, and who will overlook some healthy fat weeds if it means healthy fat wheat, who gently but firmly reminds us that our judgment is often off and that we do not, after all, own the field. Hear then the parable. One afternoon, right in the middle of summer, a group of farmhands decided they were going to surprise their boss by weeding his favorite wheat field. The second they started, though, they began to argue about what was wheat and what was weeds, and which of the weeds were okay to leave alone anyway. Blackberries? Honeysuckle? Queen Anne's lace? Which one of these were a real threat to the wheat? And they were sort of pretty, so pulling them up seemed like a bit of a shame, but they kept arguing anyway. Once they had sorted this problem out and had moved on to arguing about the buttercups, the boss arrived and ordered them out of the field. Taking away their sickles as fast as he could, he gently shepherded them to the barn and offered them a glass of water, sat them down, and invited them to just watch the field for a while. This seemed kind of dumb to them. They had seen the field 1,000,000 times before. But sipping away, they watched, and all they saw was a field of wheat with all sorts of weeds in it. And they felt a little embarrassed, clear evidence they had not done their jobs well at all. But after a while, they noticed the way the light danced over the field, first spotlighting the wheat, then the blackberries, then the honeysuckle and the Queen Anne's lace. They noticed the growth everywhere. It was a total mess. It was beautiful. And after everything had ripened and bloomed, the reapers showed up. Very carefully, gently, and expertly, they gathered the wheat up, and they used everything else to make bricks for the oven where the bread baked. The fire those bricks made was a really good one, and the bread they baked from the wheat over the bricks smelled delicious. When the baking was done, the boss called them all together and sat them down. Then he picked the bread up, blessed it, broke it, and passed it around. They all ate and declared it to be unlike any bread they had ever eaten before, and the most delicious bread ever. Let anyone with ears listen.